Hi, I'm Jialu Streeter. It's really my pleasure today to have Dr. Glenn Hubbard on my channel. Glenn is a professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Business. He served as the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors during the George W. Bush administration. So welcome, Glenn. Thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start by talking about the federal debt. So now we're in June 2023, right? The imminent threat of a government default has passed, and the Democrats and Republicans have struck a deal. But in your column articles, you have said many times, there is a surface argument, which is whether we should raise the debt ceiling, but there's also underlying argument, which is, whether we're on a sustainable trajectory. So do you think, this deal that we got right now is somehow getting us back on track for a sustainable fiscal trajectory?
No, not at all. It's simply a way to get past the debt ceiling miasma. We've been on an unsustainable trajectory for decades in the United States, but it has gotten much worse. And it's easy to see why. If you looked back before 1970 at debt to GDP ratios, not just for the United States, but pick any major industrial democracy, all you would see is hills and valleys, war and peace. So a country would borrow a lot of money to fight a war, it would pay it back and grow, and that's how debt stayed stable. What's happened since 1970 has been an explosion of what's called entitlement programs in the United States, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, that grow on autopilot, not like the war and peace example. And we don't really have budget institutions that inform the American people about what those obligations really are. So to make a long story short, something has to happen, and something has to happen to those programs. Either we have to pay more and keep them at the size they are, or we have to trim them back, but there's no door number three.
Yeah, I spoke with someone who's an expert in Social Security, and he mentioned, now people over 60, they are, they are fully vetted, right? Because they paid into the Social Security and they know their benefit is going to be good. So for politicians, there's really no benefit for the politicians to cut benefit because they're going to lose the vote. So how is that ever going to work out?
Well, the problem politically is both harder and easier than that. Harder in the sense that it's not just people over 60, it's the anticipation even by younger people that these programs will be there for them when in fact they can't. I mean, unless taxes change or benefits change. It's easier, though, in the sense that these programs are funded by trust funds, which aren't real trust funds in the sense that economists would use that term. But it does mean that when the trust funds run out of money, Washington goes into a crisis. That will happen in Medicare and Social Security over the next decade. And so that will be an action-forcing event for change. So in that sense, change has to happen. But you're right. Not only do politicians not want to talk about it, they've actively started to talk about it, but saying, we'll never cut Social Security, we'll never cut Medicare. But of course, that can't be true.
So if you just look at government data and you look at like debt to GDP ratios, so it's been rising, not just for the US and not just for advanced economies, but it's rising for both advanced economies like US and also for developing countries in the past 20 years, particularly. So I'm just wondering, what is really going on in the world? Why do we see governments getting bigger and bigger, and their debt to GDP relative debt level gets bigger and bigger?
What's different between the major industrial democracies and emerging economies? In the major industrial democracies, it really is a story about old age programs. In this country, we call it Social Security and Medicare, but they're analog around the world, mainly because most of the systems in democracies were pay-as-you-go systems. So that means they're vulnerable to two things. One is beneficiaries living longer, which thankfully is true. We are now all living much longer than elderly people 2 generations ago. But the second is fewer working people, because demographic trends have lowered fertility in almost all industrial economies. So in the West, it's really a story about what we would call entitlement programs. In emerging markets, it's a series of bad luck events, the COVID-19 pandemic being the most recent, and those economies are much more vulnerable. Many of them are borrowing in currencies not their own, and so inflation, devaluation isn't an option. And so I think those are where the really serious debt problems will be in the next 5 years.
So do you think economists are talking about this issue right now? Now the pandemic is behind us, and then maybe we should adopt some better fiscal policies to get us back on track?
Well, economists have been both unhelpful and helpful. Unhelpful in the sense that we use numbers that are so impossibly big, the public doesn't understand. So when we say unfunded liabilities of Social Security, Medicare, plus the official debt are more than $70 trillion, people don't know what we mean. A better way to express it would be work like Alan Auerbach and Bill Gale have done to say, what if you had a once and for all increase in taxes or reduction in spending? How big would that need to be relative to GDP? And the answer is 4 to 5 percentage points, which is huge. So that's the frame. And I think where economists have been more helpful recently is saying, what are some institutional reforms that could help? One example would be a spending limitation. Tim Kaine and I had proposed this about a decade ago that said you can't spend more than a moving average of inflation-adjusted revenue over a period of time. If there's an emergency, Congress can override it, but it would take a supermajority. If you don't want to use a spending limit, the other is to say, have a dedicated consumption tax to fund these programs, and then change the tax rate as those programs become more costly so that people understand, hey, this is more expensive. It's costing me money. Do I really want it? I think those are the kind of institutional reforms we need.
Are there any countries in the world that have been doing something similar as what you said?
Well, the countries that have been the best at this are Sweden's probably the best example. When Sweden had a fiscal crisis in the 1990s, it reformed its budget institutions. So there is a fiscal policy council that effectively issues a report, holds a mirror up to the government, and is highly respected. So there are institutional changes we could make short of spending limits or tax increases that start to build public awareness. Because right now you hear politicians saying, I'm not going to raise taxes and I'm not going to cut spending. And you go, well, how's that going to work?
Yeah, it does not add up. So you mentioned about mass flourishing, right? We need to make sure manufacturing workers in Youngstown are not left behind when we have economic transition, or when we talk about some trade policies, for example. I think that kind of topic has been talked a lot and explored a lot. But what I have in mind, and I'm wondering, and I'd really love to get your thoughts on, is more like, people who are having gone to universities, and then they have certain level of skills. They may not have a PhD or graduate degree, but they have gone to universities. And I have observed that there is a increasing mass of administrative workers in, say, universities, in government. And it seems like, I may be wrong, but it seems like they're not really producing anything like, producing a car or producing anything that's concrete. But seems like what we're doing is sort of like secretarial work, like, paperwork, like moving money from one pocket to another. So what is your thought on that?
Well, I think you're asking really two different questions, and they're both interesting. One is, do we have too many administrative people relative to professional people in a job? For example, in a university, are there too many administrators relative to faculty in a government agency? Are there too many managers relative to line workers? The answer to that's probably yes, and the forces in those institutions aren't the same as in the private sector, where competition and market forces usually discipline inefficiency. So that really is an issue. But the value of college is probably the bigger question you're asking. First of all, not everybody needs to go to college. There are plenty of very good jobs in the US economy that do not require a college education. And so when we tell all young people you need to go to college to succeed, that's just not true. And in fact, getting a college degree from a university that's not very good in a subject area that's not very marketable, and borrowing money to do it is a recipe for disaster. So I think we need to be much more candid with young people about what are employment prospects of particular kinds of degrees and whether college makes sense for you. I think that's a very rich discussion. Fortunately, a lot of tech companies, the state of Maryland, others have, intervened with certificate programs saying you no longer really need these credentials of a BA or a graduate degree. I think that's a super healthy conversation.
Yeah, I feel that same way. I worked in a liberal arts college on the East Coast for 6 years, and we had a lot of students taking out student loans. But when I talk with them, I felt there's no calculation of the return of investment, and they have no idea like how much money they're going to get. They have a rough ballpark idea, but they never had that calculation of whether this investment, this taking out the loans, actually makes sense or not economically.
No, it's a great point. For example, in business schools, I was dean of Columbia Business School for many years. We put out every year an employment report that said, here's how many of our students went to this kind of job or this kind of job. Here's the median, max salary that they got. And so when you're coming into school, you can say, okay, if I borrow money, I know how much I'm making now. I can calculate, is this really worth it for me? Colleges could be doing the same thing. A college could say, our engineering graduates make this much, our social science graduates make this much, our humanities graduates make this much. It's not a value judgment, it's just information for students so they can figure out, is it really worth borrowing money to do that?
Yeah, totally. Related to that, there's also a labor shortage in certain areas, right? So we now know, like, plumbers, they're actually making pretty good money, but there is a huge shortage of plumbers. And nurses, those kind of jobs, there's a big shortage. And people who are in those careers, they're making fairly good money. So I just don't quite understand why, as economists, you would think people respond to price signals, and then there should be an increasing supply of labor. And why we don't see that, and why we still see this mismatch of labor.
Well, it's a great point, and I think part of it is the lack of information. Many young people don't know what's the return to me from being a nurse or from not going to college and taking vocational education to be a plumber. The more information we get out there, the better. One way to get at these supply constraints is to have local educational institutions, particularly community colleges that tend to be the foot soldiers for many of these careers, work with local businesses and employers. And the employer can say, if you could give me more people like this, I could hire them. That enables the community college or the local university to develop a program that develops those young people, and the matching becomes a lot easier. There are some examples of that around the country, but I think it's something that local business leaders and local governments could push.
Yeah. And also related to college education, so you probably have noticed this too, we see a declining enrollment of male students relative to female students, right? And also we have seen stories about reports about female students consistently getting higher GPAs in universities. Do you think there's sort of a discouragement faced by a lot of our male students?
Well, I think it's part of a broader social problem of what's happening to men in terms of their connection with the productive economy. We know that male labor force participations have been in decline for a long time, and disastrously so, in my view, for younger people. It's not simply about the income possibilities of work. It's about the dignity, it's about the social attachment to other individuals in a community. So to me, this is also about making men aware of possibilities. I think many men who are dissatisfied with college potential don't realize that there are plenty of other jobs that don't even require college. Some of the skilled trades that mentioned before, maybe they could pursue that. Maybe we could be doing more to enrich the college experience for men. But we should all want both men and women to do well in college. Women don't seem to need a boost. They're doing just fine on their own. But I do think we have a male problem.
Do you think that male problem started earlier, before college, or more around teenage years?
Well, I'm not an education expert, but it is the case that in the days, let's say, when I went to school, young men were attached through vocational education, even in high school, taking shop and things like that. It could be that that's a better idea. There are social scientists like Richard Reeves at Brookings who have, more far-reaching reforms of education to try to bring boys and then young men more up to code.
Okay, maybe let's talk about growth. So I think you have, in many public speaking, you have talked about we should have pro-growth policies in the US, because if the growth rate is high, if growth rate is higher than the interest rate, then we can actually, theoretically, we can afford to have a lot of debt. Do you agree with that, like theoretically?
Yes, although there's an asterisk for the US. That may sound like a detail, but it isn't. Our big entitlement programs actually grow with wages, and so you can't grow your way out of the problem. But yes, we're all better off if the economy's growing faster.
So what kind of pro-growth policies should we be looking at right now? If you have, say, tomorrow you're going to talk with the president, you say, here are the 3 policies we should look at.
Well, I think we once spent a great deal on basic research at the federal government level. We're not doing as much of that. So much of research is done in the private sector. And of course, private firms are going to do research that they can appropriate the value of. That's the rational thing to do. So I think we need to significantly increase our basic research spending. Remember that the defense industry, the space industry, developed a lot of things that then permeated through the private sector. Our fundamental research in the NIH and the National Science Foundation, likewise, I think we need to go back to that mindset. I think we could also spend much more at the federal level on applied research centers around the country. More than 100 years ago, we had the innovation of land-grant colleges that, in addition to democratizing education, had both agricultural and manufacturing extension services that drove productivity. In today's economy, applied research centers around the country could help local businesses and local people be more productive. One of the great mysteries in economics, largely from work that John Van Reenen, Nick Bloom, who's a Stanford colleague, and others have done, is how many firms are inside the productivity frontier. And so when we talk about let's push the frontier, that's great, but we'd be doing a lot if we just drag the inefficient firms to the frontier. So a growth agenda needs to focus on all those things. I do think that regulatory barriers are also a problem. There's some fascinating work economists have been doing lately on the costs of regulation. There's certainly benefits as well, but we need to have more rigorous cost-benefit analysis. And then finally, the problem that Ed Glazer at Harvard and others have pointed to recently is that productivity in construction and other trades has fallen so much in recent decades as a result of hyper-regulation. And we really need to ask ourselves, do we need all of this?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I feel like, if we don't have enough growth, and then it's very easy for countries like, China or Japan or other East Asian countries to catch up with us.
China is also going to face enormous challenges in productivity growth because it lacks the efficient market discipline that the U.S. has. Where the U.S. could productively learn from China, I think, is very large spending on research, which the Chinese government is definitely doing.
Yeah, totally agree. So let's talk about AI and labor productivity. So a lot of people are worried about the development of ChatGPT and similarly other AI technologies going to disrupt the labor market. And, famously people say, you don't have to worry about AI, but you have to worry about people who use AI, right? So what's your thought on the implication of AI?
It's a great question, but, to remind, we've been there before. So when I teach political economy, I usually put up a slide that says, here's this disruptive innovation that completely overthrew the leading institution of its day, revolutionized communication and the way we work. And people start students start chatting about social media and so on. And then I put up a picture of Gutenberg in the printing press. It overthrew the Catholic Church, the dominant institution of the day. It completely changed communication. We've been through this many, many times. Now, I don't say that to minimize the impact of generative AI, but merely to say that we have adapted to these changes many, many times. The issue for generative AI compared to, say, the printing press or even more recent innovations is how quickly this is all going to move and how disruptive for occupations that weren't used to being disrupted. So you mentioned earlier steel workers in Youngstown. That's an old story, goes back to 1970s. But here I'm thinking of junior accountants, lawyers, McKinsey consultants. You know, these are not people who were used to the disruption of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. For the most intuitive 99th percentile person in a professional services organization, generative AI is a huge productivity enhancer to that individual. But for many people in the middle who were doing more routine tasks to prepare that star, they may not be needed. I mean, generative AI may be able to replace them. So I think there's a disruption possibility that's big. At the same time, think about how it makes us all more productive. So I have a freshman textbook in economics, and one of the things I'm proud of is the work I'm doing with my publisher on a very patient AI that can work with a student at his or her level. So the more mistakes you make, the more help we give you, the smarter you are, the faster we move you. That wouldn't have been possible a decade ago. So I know a lot of people say, oh, generative AI is going to kill traditional education. I think it's the opposite. I think it'll make us much more effective in getting to the level of an individual student.
Yeah, totally agree. I do feel for students who are still growing and learning, this is totally, probably a net plus. And as you said, it's probably for existing workers who have outdated skills and then they could be replaced down the road. I mean, for example, what you said about the lawyers, right? I mean, more maybe like a junior lawyer who's preparing the paperwork and now he does not have to do that work anymore. So that leads me to the question of the meaning of work. Sometimes I feel, what is the meaning of work? Do we really have to be in the office 5 days a week, 8 hours a day? Or should we just maybe go to the office twice a week? As the work from home phenomena have shown, the productivity has not changed.
At the beginning, I think more business people have become more skeptical. I don't think we're going to go back to 2019, 5 days, 8 hours. That said, I think a few observations are in order about work. First, work is very important. It's not just a paycheck. It really is a social connection. Second, being in the office sometimes is extremely important for human connection, for advancement, for creativity and joint projects. But I think we're groping toward that in a very good way. I think, it will be noisy, bumpy, but we will get to a level. Having worked in a university all my life, I'm used to this. We don't have to come in every day. But I think if you ask yourself, why are professors generally in all the time? It's because of the value of being in all the time. And I think if people don't feel that way about their work, an employer should ask, well, why don't they? What could we be doing to make the creativity of bringing people together such that they want to come in?
Yeah. Oh, so what do you think about the recent headline? I don't know whether you see it. It's called as the engagement of employees decline after pandemic, they call it the quietly quitting. Employees are quietly quitting. And so what I don't even know how to make of it. Have you seen those articles?
Yeah, first of all, a recession will kill quiet quitting. So I spend a lot of time worrying about it. But I do worry about an attitude toward it because it says to me, people aren't thinking hard enough about why work is important. If you don't like your job well enough to be really pouring your heart and soul into it, trying to learn more, you're not in the right job. And for most people who are college educated, they need to work on getting that right match. So I think quiet quitting is a huge mistake for the people who are doing it, not just because the labor market trends that are coming from a downturn will discipline it, but because they're missing an opportunity to get more out of work.
Yeah, totally agree. I have two more questions left. So one is a question from my husband. Hope he's watching. So he's saying, he grew up near Boston, and he's saying, like, when I was young in the 70s and 80s, my dad was working, my mom is a housewife. We were able to afford a house, nice house, and everything seems like fine, just on one paycheck. And now, both of us have PhDs. We're both working like full time. It seems like life is not as pleasant. So, like, do you have that kind of observation why things are getting harder, especially economically?
Well, let me make an argument in agreement and then one in disagreement. The one in agreement is I do think there is a cost of living issue for most people in the country. If you break things up into healthcare, education, housing, for a variety of public policy reasons, those things cost a lot more than they should. And their relative prices have changed a lot from the time my parents had me as a young person to when I have younger kids. But the part I would disagree with is I think many people's aspirations today are just different than they were a generation ago. When I hear young people express what a lifestyle is that they expect to live in their 30s, I never expected that. I'm sure my parents never expected that. And so the income required to live that is very different. So yes, there's a cost of living problem, but there's also an expectations issue. The final thing I would say is having two people work can be just fine if that's what they want to do. I mean, it may be that, if both people in a couple find fulfillment in work, I don't see that as a problem.
Thank you. Last question is about economics education. So I do see, a lot of the current economic PhD programs, like, we feel like we're in the math program, feel like we're just solving models and then doing computerization all the time. Do you think that's the right way to go? And do you think that's why sometimes, like, economists nowadays are like sort of like miss the big signals of something that's going down?
Well, I think it's useful and not enough at the same time. It's useful in the sense that what models do is give you a framework. I often think in terms of Washington discussions. Having a model in your mind helps you be able to talk through a problem or talk to a senior leader, a cabinet member, or the president about that problem. But it's not enough for two reasons. One, I think you need, as an economist, to know much more about what's going on at high frequency in the real world. When I was at the Council of Economic Advisors, I put together a group of CEOs that I called every couple of weeks just for a reality check on the kinds of thinking that I was doing. But the other that's harder for economists, but we really need to do, is go back to our founding. So I mentioned I teach political economy. I'm stunned at the number of econ PhDs who probably have never read Adam Smith or Malthus or Ricardo or Marx or Schumpeter or even Keynes.
We're busy solving models.
Yeah. And that's a shame because you need a sense of where these big questions came from in the discipline. I think it makes you a better scholar. It's not about just being, quote, well-rounded. I think it makes you a better scholar.
Thank you so much. Well, that's really, really interesting. I just thank you so much for sharing your time with me on a Saturday afternoon.
No, that's my pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.